Hello and welcome to Varn, and today I'm with Marco from the Angry Workers Collective. For those of you who don't follow British left, ultra left adjacent groupings, the Angry Workers Collective is primarily based in the UK. Really came to the fore about 6 years ago, as far as our knowledge of you here in America, with Class Power at 0 Hours. Which was a very interesting book, which got me into looking at the class composition and logistics challenges of organizing in West London, which is both very different and yet also structurally similar to things that happen here in the States. And it was interesting to have that contrast. We are primarily talking about a document you released the first part of here in April. People can find it on your website, and I will link it in the show notes, called Revolutionary Working Class Strategy for the 21st Century. And part one. So I wanted to really kind of focus in on some key points in this document, but also because it brings up some very big issues in trying to organize today. And one thing I really like about Angry Workers' work, as opposed to, I don't know, what can get put out by here, the Workerist, like Jacobin Magazine, Workerist in quotations, where there's not an acknowledgement of the deep divides that have been created in labor by production capacity, by immigration, by all kinds of things. So you start in your, well, I should say the Angry Workers Collective starts in their strategy document here by calling for us to revise the concept of combined and uneven development and even the concept of class composition. Why do you think we need to start there?
Yeah, first of all, thanks for having me, Derek. I think we started with like a contradiction that compared to, let's say, 1848 or 1917, the general condition of being a wage worker has been so universalized across the globe. So we can, for the first time, actually talk about a global working class, which was very difficult to talk about like in 1848 or even in 17. So while the condition has been universalized, actually somehow the working class disappeared as a subject. So that's like something that everyone has to grapple with when they look at current movements. People say, okay, they're populist movements or anti-corruption. That's often a very superficial description of these movements. Sometimes the global situation is described as it's a multiverse or a multitude. So people are not talking actually about different class segments. They're not really trying to understand whether there is something like a global working class emerging and what the main divisions are. But they try to give it like fancy names, or they use like geographical descriptions, say, global South, global North, or the Arab Spring when they talk about movements. So our question was like, what are the theoretical concepts that the revolutionary movement gave us, the movement from the past? And we came across two main concepts that really enable us to develop strategies from within the class. So there have been a lot of revolutionary strategies, let's say from Maoist strategies to encircle the towns, or guerrilla strategies, or let's build one big union. But to really kind of try to understand it from within the class, for us, these two concepts are, quite like, the most significant, let's put it like that. And if you look at the concept of, combined and development - permanent revolution, that was developed in about 1905, 1917, so during a revolutionary cycle, and class composition, end of the 60s. So again, it was like, it came out of the moment, so to speak. And yeah, that's what we, decided to look more into these two concepts, which surprisingly have never really been discussed together, because I think the two segments of the left that refer to them are quite, somehow separated in their debates. So for us, it was interesting to look at these concepts, and I can go into them in a bit if you want.
Oh, I would love you to. Although I am interested in that statement you made there. Which sections of the left are focused on each of these concepts? Like, because I also agree with you that you rarely see them tied together, other than the angry workers. Maybe Viewpoint magazine kind of tried a little bit, but in general, it hasn't really been attempted. But knowing which sections of the left you see as championing each concept might give us clarity about why they're not combining them together.
Yeah, I mean, because let's say the concept of uneven combined development was developed around Trotsky, not just by Trotsky. You could say Marx started with it, by looking at how potentially the Obshchina, meaning the Russian village commune, could combine with the Western industrial power of, workers in the more developed West. That was like maybe the foundation of something like a concept of uneven development and how it could combine in a revolutionary moment. But yeah, it was mainly like developed by Trotsky, and therefore I think it's somehow, if at all, discussed then within the Trotskyist left. And class composition, came out of a Marxist Italian debate that then, let's say, in the English world has been fairly academic. So it became more, a cultural, sociological concept rather than really like a working class concept of working class politics. So I think that might be one of the reasons why, they're separate words. But you're right, like Viewpoint magazine, probably the only kind of project that came maybe close to trying to see these concepts together.
So what is your collective's take on to use an unfortunate term, but on the relationship between class composition and an even development? Like what are some specific trends that you've seen, et cetera, et cetera?
I don't know, maybe if we go a step back and try to summarize the concept of uneven and combined development, it might help
Let's do
to
that.
see the differences. So, I mean, it was a concept that came out of 1905. The fact that Russia got beaten by Japan in the Russian-Japanese War, and then also out of the first, let's say, Council Revolution. And at the time, large parts of the left saw Russia as in an isolated national kind of framework, and mainly seeing it as a anachronistic dictatorship that was basically in the way of a democratic progress that could then maybe create a workers' movement. So everyone, like the German social democracy, but even Lenin himself, saw it mainly like it will be maybe capable for democratic revolution, but not like let's not talk about international or socialist revolution. I think Trotsky tried to understand how the situation in Russia is actually interlinked with a social dimension, and he said, like, under these conditions also of national strife, of war, even a country like Russia is forced to develop a modern industry, a modern war industry. And Russia can only do that if it engages in a credit, in a financial relation with the West. So a lot of the credits came via France or Western world, also for grain export. So we've got like an economic interlinking where the engagement with the Western economies basically bolstered an anachronistic regime, which at the same time is forced into a development that then it can't contain. And there, I think the interesting bit starts, because if we look what kind of industries emerged, these were very large, I mean, concentrated and very large scale. So the average size of an industrial unit in Russia was way bigger than, for example, compared to England or Germany. So immediately it was a large scale industry where there were workers who didn't go through an artisan kind of a trade kind of stage, but came from the countryside into these big industries. And there were hardly any kind of sources of or strata of mediation. So no big trade unions, no bourgeois labor laws. So that could explain why there was quite a fundamental radicalization taking place that the regime couldn't contain. And I think that was then the basis to think that, okay, if this combination can happen on the political economic level, it could also happen on the level of revolutionary politics. So the fact that an international relation can bring about an industrial process in a regime that is antiquated in many senses and can't contain it, that can also be the material base to have a revolutionary strategy that is international. And I think Trotsky was the only one who somehow maintained that. And I think, it was not like out of an ideology. I think it was based on a very kind of insightful analysis. And if we come to the term or concept of class composition, I think it starts more from the actual relation within capital, so to speak, whereas like uneven combined development looks at capitalist regions and differences in development. Class composition looks more at how is the class composed within a social production process, and where are the, let's say, center points? Where are the points where the relation between machinery, technology, cooperation of workers is sharpened to a point where a collective subject emerges that can then become a point of attraction for the wider class. I mean, that's basically what happened in Italy. And I think in that sense, we operate on two different levels, in the sense of uneven development can explain maybe why movements in certain regions of the world can only go so far. In the sense that, in Egypt, if you look at the economy in Egypt, where 70% of the food is imported, where you've got a fairly small industrial working class, we can somehow maybe not predict, but we can probably anticipate that it will be very difficult for such a movement to go beyond a certain stage, just because of its base. Similar to, I don't know, deindustrialized service economy regions. So what I'm saying is, I think we need a concept to understand regional compositions. But these are not like just, how do you say, geographically confined. These are crisscrossed by something like global supply chains, by extraction economies, by, currently we see it by war, which is like a logistical effort. So I think what we need in order to develop some kind of strategy are, say a communist or a working class understanding of development, based on what kind of stage of development for each region, and also for internal class divisions in these regions. What are the main challenges for movement that occur in these regions, and how are these regions but still connected to other stages of development through, for example, labor migration, through supply chains, through in currently war situations. And I think this is just let's say the basis was what we have to operate, and then the question is, how can we organizationally relate to that?
One thing this brings to mind is the way you're using development is very different than the way a lot of leftists use development, which is very much out of either liberal developmentalism or out of Marxist-Leninist use of developmentalism, which are weirdly kind of similar. As one of the things that I've, there's ways in which Jeffrey Sachs can sound like a Leninist depending on the day. So when we talk about developmental stages here, how would we come up with that, and how would it be different than the way we kind of typically talk about development now?
Yeah, I guess, with class composition, you could say like, okay, development of the relation between workers on capital, in the sense, do we have a collective workforce? Do we have a workforce that, cooperates on a mass level, that is connected somehow to also the productive knowledge of the production process that they are situated in? Kind of what is the role of unemployment? How prevalent is unemployment? What about an informal sector? Not in the sense of, is there still development to do, but like from a, let's say, class point of view, it's the question is always, what can different segments of the class bring to a movement? Let's say the experience of capitalist productivity, if you know that you shape the world through your labor, you feel the contradiction between what capitalist technology and knowledge would be enable us to and what the reality is. I mean, this kind of contradiction is, I would say, it's a main revolutionary contradiction between the reality of the application of technology and knowledge now, and the potential that it had to make a good life for everyone. But this contradiction is experienced differently according to what your class position is, even within the working class. So if you work in a big warehouse, you have an idea of how many goods are circulated in the economy, but you don't necessarily have a good understanding of how they are produced. Maybe if you are in a fairly high-paying job in a car factory, you roughly understand how despotic capitalist productivity is and how it could be organized differently without major, let's say, major problems, let's say. But you might not understand the, a condition of being excluded, of having to deal with the state power in a very direct sense, or even with, with the question of exclusion and oppression. So these kind of segments would somehow have to combine within a movement in order to make it revolutionary. It's not like necessarily, we all need class consciousness, and we all have to kind of understand that we are part of a class, but these different segments have to come and combine in a movement where the question of, fighting against the oppression of being poor and marginalized, and the collective power that you have by being in a production process together with others, where this comes somehow together and forms the basis for an alternative. And I think for this, the problem, how can these segments come together? The organizational question has to be answered out of that. That's the main challenge. Organization is not like a big vehicle where you can recruit people to, and then these kind of class differences are somehow dissolved. I mean, I think organization always exists. Like how can advanced points of the class, not because of their consciousness, but because they are in a material position, maybe to influence struggles in a different way than other parts of the class. How can you build political bridges? How can you somehow create a mirror and say, like, okay, these are our conditions as a class, and they exist in a certain separation. How can we relate to that politically?
One thing this leads me to think a lot about is the relationship of this development patterns. I mean, globally, I lived in Egypt actually for a little while, believe it or not, and remember the sugar riots that were led by working class people when they floated the currency, and everything went from bad to a lot worse for a little while. Which was then used by the LCC government in response to Islamist attacks during that period to invoke the national security law, et cetera, et cetera. And I remember thinking about the way things like the Arab Spring and the reaction to the Arab Spring are reported. And like the class dynamics of the Arab Spring were completely missed, right? But I also started thinking about the interconnectedness of it all because, for example, just because you brought up Egypt, that's one I know a lot about. You're right. It imports most of its food now, and that's actually a historical anomaly. It used to be the breadbasket for Southern Europe and North Africa, but that's not the case anymore. And mismanagement of land, a whole bunch of reasons. But there is a way in which, the Egyptian worker is like completely outside of what the European worker is experiencing, and yet also completely dependent on what the European worker is experiencing because of exports and everything else. I think here in the States, to kind of maybe drive this point a little bit more home, the economy here is, way different than Egypt, and yet the service sector looks a lot like the Egyptian worker because there's very little relationship to production. It's mostly been automated. I mean, it exists, but it's been automated. There is factory jobs, which are people focus on, are like mining jobs. Another historical focus are in the United States fairly high paid jobs. They're rare. You don't meet that many people with them. I mean, if you were to add manufacturing and mining together, I think, and not separate management and non-management job here, that's between 11 and 15% of the economy, of the jobs in the economy, excuse me, not of economic output. Yet when we talk about organizing labor and unions, people will speak of repeating unionization patterns from this time period where that percentage of the working class was like closer to 40, maybe 45% in those fields, and you had very little automation and massive shops. So when you unionize a shop, you're unionizing, I don't know, 1, 2, 3,000 people, as opposed to when you unionize a shop, I don't know, Starbucks is 15 people, and at a factory it's 300. How do you get people to look at these relations? And I mean, that's what we're talking about, but to get like workers to look at these relations, to get people to actually think about how these things are related, but they have to change how we organize. Because I am very frustrated with a lot of the, I'm glad to see a labor left in the United States again, but it talks like it's in the 1950s.
Yeah, I mean, quantity is always difficult. Of course, let's say the relative number of industrial workers is shrinking. But if you compare it to, let's say, Russia 1917, where, let's say, the political quality of, a very, very small part of the whole population were working in bigger factories then, but they were able to produce a form of organization, the council, out of their condition as workers, that somehow could become a social form. I mean, it could become a form that also, let's say, unites either workers, or back in the day when there was still some peasants, to develop that social form of the council into a hegemonic form, like. And I think even with Egypt during the uprising, somehow, I mean, there were centers like Mahala, so like big textile towns, basically, that had a political radiation to the rest of the country. There were, I was in Iskandria and Alexandria, and they had like workers from Pirelli for a big tire factory. Obviously, quantitatively a small part, but they played a certain role of forming what they called an assembly of workers of Iskandria, where other workers could kind of relate to. And that happened when a lot of them also went to Tahrir Square and formed some kind of a social space where, let's say, people from even smaller companies, factories who were not paid went to Tahrir Square and presented their experience to the wider urban, let's say, masses that were present. I think, again, we have to ask ourselves, what are the potentials and limits of each class segment in such a moment, and how can we, let's say, develop a plan of I mean, it's an old plan, but like what does it mean, the taking over the means of production? What is revolution nowadays in the 21st century? And I think there's still like these, as a kind of dichotomy between either thinking about it in terms of civil war or general strike, and both seem like difficult. You're right. In the current situation, either seems either to being pulled into the enemy's kind of strategy in terms of civil war, or kind of thinking that we can solve the problem gradually, build to the general strike, and we just flip it over and we've got a new society. And yeah, I would think, we have to kind of analyze what could be, let's say, I don't know so much about the US kind of condition, but if you have kind of, a segment like the tech workers who become politically, let's say, uncomfortable with the type of work that they're doing, I mean, it's mainly like a political unease of workers at Google or wherever, that their labor is used for military or surveillance purposes. We've got like a large health workers and teachers kind of sector that has got close links to, let's say, impoverished communities in their areas. So they express their own interest as workers, as more or less professional workers, but they reflect also the situation of the people that they deal with as patients or students. And I think there are still some industrial areas that can create like points of attraction. The question is, like, within these let's say expressions of different segments, do we think that's enough to create one big organization for all of them, or do we really have to think of what could a process look like of organization that somehow dissolves a material separation between these segments, but also expresses something like an alternative plan in terms of economy? And there I could talk maybe a bit more about what we're doing in the health sector later on, because I mean that's somehow related. It's somehow the political proposal that we have, and yeah, it's related to the question how you can combine the idea of let's say social power, which we need as workers to defend ourselves, with the question of control, who actually controls the workplace and what our work is used for, and development of an alternative plan, an idea of transformation. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot to think about there. I'm gonna put a bullet point in that stuff about specific tactics with healthcare workers. I deal a lot with teachers, and I agree with your observation that teachers are in this weird, teachers and healthcare workers both are in this weird proletarianized professional worker category. And we have a lot of pressures on us. When we compare ourselves to other professionals, we don't look so good. But if you compare us to the general proletariat, we're still kind of on the higher end of things. And yet also we are exposed to, even if we're not in the impoverished parts of the community, unless you're in a very, very particular in America, kind of school district, you see massive poverty, et cetera, et cetera. And I feel like it gives us a little bit of a double consciousness, because we have the concerns of a proletarianized white collar worker, but we also see these communities which we see ourselves serving, and we don't see ourselves as exploiting, and we're also kind of not really exploiting them. So we do have investment there. It's not always clear. I think in a lot of teachers, it also leads to places where we have conflicting interests within ourselves due to what we see. But I do think that is why teachers and nurses tend to be more radical rank and file union people. They're not so much in our bureaucracy. That we can talk about that later too. And I think that's an interesting thing to take on, because there's been a section of the left here. I don't know if this discourse is going on in the UK or in Europe about teachers being part of the professional managerial class and casting the professional managerial class as completely apart from the workers. The issue that I have with that is that that discourse became popular at the very moment that these institutions, even some of the higher level ones like doctors, are being proletarianized. We might call them labor aristocrat proles, but they are being proletarianized. They're moving from technically being small business owners to being wage holders. That's just an objective fact. And they are also being labor disciplined in ways they have not been historically. And so it's an interesting place to be. And I liked reading your work here and Angry Workers in General back when I read Class Power, because it acknowledged that this is messy, and it's not just messy in these sectors, it's also messy in logistics and production. There are major tensions. I mean, one of the things you write about, and maybe we can talk about this because this is something that clearly affects Europe and the United States, is the way migrant workers and immigrants are used. And what they're used for, and how they're even stratified amongst themselves, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You kind of mentioned this and allude to it in this piece. It's a major part of other works I've read by the Angry Workers Collective. So how do you incorporate the tensions of migration and unstable populations into this analysis?
Yeah, but as you said, migrant labor, that's what kind of labor are we talking about?
Right.
That's a big question. You've got agriculture labor now in the UK. They wouldn't even find people from Romania or even probably Ukraine to work on the fields here anymore. They have to go to Indonesia or Nepal nowadays to get a very seasonal workforce. That's obviously very different from, let's say, the tech sector. Software programmers, engineers who come. Even in our hospital, I would say, where you've got a lot of migrant workers, who are we talking about? About the Sudanese cleaner? I mean, are we talking about the nurse from India or the Philippines who was being recruited, and her flight was paid for, and obviously she has to sign a contract for 2 years to work in the trust, otherwise she has to pay the money back. But that's quite different again from, let's say, the cleaning workforce. And again, it's different from the consultants. I mean, there are a lot of migrant doctors who come from Myanmar or from other areas of the world. So the fact that they're all migrants, I mean, there is something about the fact that they all bring their own experiences from other countries, and we've seen that that can be very decisive for workers' struggles. For example, in Italian logistics strikes, it was mainly workers from northern Africa who were somehow influenced by the Arab Spring and then brought this kind of spirit and courage into the strikes of the logistics industry. So that is always like let's say the hope that we have, that the fact that migrants come from areas where they had exposure or actual experience to social struggles, that they can somehow import that into our class struggle, which historically is, it's there are many examples of that historically. Otherwise, I mean, the state, let's say in the UK, like in the US, deals with the fact that on one hand they're very dependent on migrant labor, but at the same time they want to, let's say, create a political pressure that these workers are not supposed to raise any claims. So that's what's happening in our hospital as well. Like the state changed the visa regulation and the general, let's say, regulation for residency rights. So that creates an atmosphere of, first of all, of division and fear, but also of anger of a lot of colleagues who say, like, we take care of this kind of aging population here, and they want us to work 10 years before our kids can go to university like everyone else. What the fuck? So obviously we hope that somehow can radicalize the struggle. At the moment and in the last years, it somehow made it more difficult because people have to get to know each other. People feel replaced, that they can be replaced. So at least in the UK, this potential of migrant labor, the kind of radicalizing potential, you see only in some sectors. For example, cleaning in London, which was, for a while dominated by workers from Latin America who had a high level of political exposure and experience. They brought that into an organizing effort amongst migrant cleaners in London, or in partly also outside of that. But I think, I mean, in the current political landscape in the UK, which has got the revival of this idea, we built the left party outside, left of Labour. I think our proposal is more like, let's start political committees in sectors that are relevant for social production and reproduction, and see politics not as something that is somehow outside of that. There's a very harsh division in the UK between so-called political and economic struggle. It's a very kind of a trade union consciousness of what it means to do workplace politics. So for us, the first step in that sense would be to politicize work again, in the sense, ask, why is the work that we're doing organized in the way that it is organized? Who decides about that? Why is it often irrational? Is that just mismanagement, or is there something systemic about it? And that's what we're trying to do with our current project, Vital Signs, in the health sector. And if you're interested, I can talk about that later on a bit.
I'm very interested. We'll circle back to that in a minute. I wanted to ask you, I think I'm going to talk about surplus population first. This piece critiques the idea of surplus population, which in the United States I feel like it comes, like you'll see it a lot in an economic down cycle, then it'll go away, and you see it again in an economic down cycle, and then it'll go away. Right now, because of fears of AI and because of increasing youth unemployment and long-term structural unemployment, I even see non-Marxists using surplus population again. So I wanted to go to the critique of surplus population and the challenge that idea poses for organization.
Yeah, I mean, I think even since 2008 crisis, I mean, they are a bit scared of like creating this type of mass unemployment that you saw in the 20s. So, and at the same time, yeah, there's also because of COVID and certain kind of particular conditions, there's still a kind of labor shortage in many areas. At the same time, yeah, you've got thousands of bullshit jobs where you can easily imagine that, that's the first thing that goes in a crash. It's kind of, they won't bring your McDonald's straight to your bedroom anymore. That won't be something that, I don't know, companies can make money with. But I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. I had like experience in India where I lived for 3 years, where people often talk about the slums as a kind of major sign of surplus population. And now you can say, okay, maybe the slums that are around Delhi are not the slums that are meant, but there you don't have, even the informal economy is very tied to either running the city or and therefore reproducing wider labor force, or are very tied to the wider industrial process, textile industry, car industry. I mean, that's all happening in the slums. So I'm not sure about surplus population as a stable subject. I think there will always be like parts of the working class that are underemployed, or that are put in a position of of exclusion. But I think this is a kind of a temporary thing, even like when we look at the so-called refugee crisis in Germany, where I'm from. You had an enormous influx of people from war areas like Syria or elsewhere, and it was like in hundreds of thousands. But now, like all Amazon warehouses in Germany are basically run by the main language there is Arabic. So it's like the economy kind of integrated these kind of refugees who were seen as this is a surplus population now entering Germany, and it's kind of they managed fairly well to integrate it into the lower wage segment, and or from Amazon to other also less agriculture, but like some of the manufacturing. You've got refugees from the civil wars. So in that sense, for me the question is like how can you see that relation between, let's say, productive centers and areas of underemployment. I think workers always found answers to that, in the sense of I don't know, unemployed workers putting pressure on workers in factories to stop working overtime. In times of, let's say, high unemployment, whoever works overtime should be stopped. And there were in the 70s in Italy a lot of efforts to any kind of weekend shift that were running, and they would just go in bigger groups of so-called proletarian rounds and just shut down the factory, and say this is not on. And in time of after 73, after increasing unemployment. So for me the question is more like how do you make use of both the experience of immiseration and collective anger that comes from that, and the remaining productive force that the class has.
I guess this gives us a way to talk about your specific efforts in nursing before I go into revolutionary cycles. What have the Anglo workers collective been doing with healthcare workers, and what have you seen from that interaction?
Yeah, I mean, I think with COVID we could see that there's something like an international maybe not a wave, but some kind of new dynamic within the health sector, because first of all, there was for the first time like a mass acceptance that health workers and other so-called relevant or existential workers keep our society going. So there was a certain confidence. On the other hand, it overstretched a lot of hospital workforces to say like, this is not sustainable anymore. But also we've got the somehow more public confidence. So we saw like more kind of strikes in Germany, in the US, also in the UK, the first strike of nurses in 30 years. So we felt that was kind of interesting. I started working in hospital about 5 years ago. And I think the first thing that that interested us was to say this is not necessarily because we think the health sector is the next big, I don't know what, sector where we can develop a lot of power, or where the new kind of class subject comes from. But it was more like to create one example of trying to create what we say is like political committees in a specific workplace or industry, and what is the role of such kind of political committee. And if we look at the health sector, we said, okay, health is generally discussed as care, caring work, emotional labor, which it is. I mean, I worked on a respiratory ward during COVID, and obviously there were a lot of, let's say, tragedies, personal tragedies, and a lot of emotional work around that. But it is also very complex labor. If you look at a hospital, it's connected to university, science production, knowledge production. It's connected to international global pharmaceutical and equipment manufacturers. It's connected to the community. I mean, hospitals range. I mean, when we, let's say, discharge our patients from the surgical ward where I'm working now, we do very detailed surveys of their living conditions. Do they own their house or not? Are they tenants? Do they live alone? What do they have at home? What does their nutrition look like? So it's like a sensor into the wider class. And I think for us, the question is, how can we politicize this as a laboratory of a potential social alternative? I mean, the NHS, it's 1.4 million workers, which the most complex supply chain, if you look at all the stuff that we're using, was very, very complex, let's say, circulation of information and decisions. I mean, it's the amount of information that the health sector creates in terms of new types of treatments, how best practice, all the information about individual patients, it's mind-boggling basically. And the question is like, this is happening in a capitalist, although the NHS is public, but still like the inner hierarchies, this kind of the internal structure, the dependency on the wider, both financial budget, but also like the corporations that are necessary, from software to pharma to whatever. How is it running now, and how could it be done differently? I think this is somehow the role that we see. Have a debate about from the various perspective of different workers in this very complex, let's say, organism. How they experience the systemic contradictions in their daily work, and how they think that, let's say, in a moment where we expand the worker control within the sector, what would be the first task in the 100 days of taking over this kind of organism? What would be the first 100 days of a health sector under worker control? What are the what are the main things that we can do in a short period of time, and what are the things that have to be done? And that, turn that into a discussion that is, let's say, closely related to the day-to-day struggles, because all that makes very little sense, or it becomes very abstract if it's not connected to the daily question of, who controls the way that we work on the ward, who controls what kind of implants we are using, and if let's say the cobalt that is used in the hip implant is coming from a mine in Congo, and these kind of questions. What is the power relation in the day-to-day work? And for that, we try to use things like the magazine, where we've got different interviews from pharmaceutical workers to hospital to community workers, and where we discuss what's the role of the health sector in a revolutionary transition, or whatever you want to call it.
Well, this actually brings up a larger theoretical question that I've gotten from this piece that we're discussing, and also some other pieces of angry worker collective work. And that is, you talk a lot about revolutionary cycles. I wanted to ask you, what drives these revolutionary cycles? Why do they seem to come up every generation and a half? Although we haven't had one in a while. There does seem to be some consistency to this, but there's other ways in which these revolutionary cycles, if you just take them as hyper-determined or automatic, you're going to be wrong too, because they don't look like each other. The late 60s to 70s looks very different from from 1914 to 1930. So what do you think is driving these cycles? And then just to pivot to where we're going, I'm probably going to ask you, when we do these things like the organizing committees for the nurses, how does that relate to these cycles?
I don't know. I mean, historically, you probably have a big and either a global situation of crisis through war, or other forms of crisis that forces people to face the fact that we're living in a situation where things are not just getting better by themselves, or by voting for a different government, or it's kind of an impasse. But at the same time, the realization that we are able to kind of pose an alternative. So it's not just like the immiseration. It's not like, okay, this is really, the crisis is really, really deep now. But it's the feeling that potentially the situation could be much different if and we've got the means to make it different. What is necessary for that? It's a good question. We talked to Sergio Bologna, who's a old comrade from Italy, who was part of the 60s, and he said there's a certain, let's say, contradiction when it comes to organizational question, also in a revolutionary cycle, which we can say maybe the 60s, 70s in Italy were. And he said a lot of the workers that formed let's say the autonomous revolutionary organizations, collective assemblies, had some background often in the mainstream, let's say either in the Communist Party, Socialist Party, or often in trade unions. So there's a certain continuation between, let's say, the institutions and the organizations of the labor movement. But the contradiction is that these organizations, once a revolutionary cycle starts, become they're turned into complete stumbling blocks, into barriers for the development. So on one hand, you've got there seem to be a precondition, a certain kind of socialization of individuals within something like the labor movement. On the other hand, these organizations that maybe transmitted some of that knowledge, they become a hindrance. And I don't know, I think you have to, if you want to organize, you have to keep that in mind, that there's the question is how does organization relate to something like spontaneity, to revolutionary chaos. I think part of strategy is not so much how can you build up your organization to a degree that it becomes politically dominant, but rather how do you relate to the advanced and not so advanced moments in a movement, and how do you push the, let's say, revolutionary content, communist content in each situation. And that's, I think that's different from the understanding of most of the left, who think, okay, you have the program and then you have got the mass organization and from there you go. And I'm not saying that the work, the day-to-day work that people think the mass organization should do is probably correct, and it becomes like a fertile ground. But once you enter like a revolutionary cycle, I think to imagine that you are then let's say the main container of the movement or the vanguard is often kind of rather misleading if you look at actual revolutionary moments. No?
Well, that last part of that statement gets me thinking about something I wanted to ask you about, which is where do political activists, like communist, quotations or non-quotations, sincere or not, organizers play a role if they don't see themselves as part of the class, which is often sometimes even factually true. I mean, like the number of people I know who are professional socialist activists who make their living as professional socialist activists, which means that they rely on donations. One could even see them as either depending on their relationship to the state, either a subordinate of the state or a subordinate of rent seeking. How should we relate to those kinds of activists, and what role can they play, positively or negatively?
Well, I mean, it's a difficult question. I think it's always the question: at what service are you? Are you doing this for your personal career, to write your PhD, or to, I don't know, run your particular organization, or even is it mainly because you have got then a privileged situation and an income, or do you put it at the service of the movement? I think that should always be the question. I think it's a form of alienation. I don't know why people would choose to be outside of the class, in the sense of, I'm a professional labor journalist, or, I'm, writing books about class struggle. I find it personally quite an alienating thought. I would like to be and experience physically and mentally the conditions that I'm writing about, and it allows me to also relate on a much deeper, not just kind of cognitive level, to the conditions of the people that I want to organize with. So why would I choose an existence where I'm outside of that? But some people do that for various reasons, and some people do it in an okay way. I think there are people who write research about a particular historical struggle or an ongoing tendencies within the class, and try to do a lot to bring that back to the class and into the debate. I mean, I think that's minoritarian, but a movement has to, I think, develop standards, to these comrades, and say like, okay, if we want to organize together, you're not just coming here, make a few quick interviews and then go back and write your PhD, but you either part of this, and then we discuss together how your free time and your privilege and access to, let's say, libraries or the academic circles, you have to collectivize that, and you make it part of a collective decision. How do we best utilize the fact that you might have more time at the moment to write something, or it has to be has to become like a collective issue, which is it's not easy, because people often treat it as their personal thing. I'm so and so, I'm doing I'm the labor journalist, or I'm doing this and that.
Mm-hmm. It seems to be a challenge, in so much that I think I also agree with you that not all these activists are bad, that they could be useful. Some of them are highly deleterious, but the big thing is like, how do you have a standard for sorting that out? Like, how, what is the minimum requirement of participation? Um, if you're going to, let's say you're not just a student, you're not just like a grad student. Let's say you, I don't know, do a podcast, because in the United States we have a proliferation of left-wing podcasts. I say this as a left-wing podcast, that have done about as much for the struggle as the TV news, which is to say almost nothing. I'm not gonna say it's never anything. I mean, news is important, and sometimes getting class-oriented news out is important. But there's also the paradox that we've like created, minor socialist millionaires off of the media, and yet the political stages here are probably worse than they were when this trend began. And so, like, I like this idea of like collectively coming up with like what is acceptable and not acceptable for activists to do. What is acceptable and not acceptable for activists to what do they have to give back if you are profiting somehow from this? What do you owe? And I think these are very important questions.
Yeah.
I think to come back to like specific things, we talked a little bit about healthcare sector. What other sectors have you guys in the Anglia Workers Collective seen develop workers committees and councils and whatnot, and where do you see them going?
I mean, to be honest, like in the UK, there's not so much. There's a traditional, let's say, more Trotskyist left who might organize in bigger workplaces, but it's very limited in the sense maybe the railways in London Underground and the post office. This is maybe where some of them also try to not just work and take on trade union positions, but actually maybe produce like a magazine or a workplace group or these kind of things. But it's very minimal. If you look at like 100, 200,000 people who are in the orbit of, let's say, the new left outside, of labor, I think very few of them work collectively, let's say, in a certain industry and go beyond, let's say, an ordinary rank and file union activity, which is okay. I'm not like saying that it's not a good thing to do. I'm a union rep myself. Mm-hmm. But to really like come up with an internal critique of one's industry and say, okay, this is how under capitalist conditions things are organized. How can we organize it differently? What is a power question here? It's not just about having better ideas, but like how to enforce them. All that is seems a very marginal existence at the moment. If you look at Italy currently, I think the situation might be more interesting. Kind of the biggest movement, mainly also about the war question, but it has brought kind of new like working class initiatives together. Some old ones, for example, the dock workers, who, despite all the reduction in terms of quantity, obviously dock workers have been kind of minimized by containerization, automation, and things. But there's still a lot of them around, and they still have a internationalist perspective due to the work that they're doing. And in Italy, they had a major influence. We had like the car workers of GKN who were like occupied the factory now for I don't know how long, over years, and said, okay, we want to convert this former car factory into a let's say community-owned or worker-controlled productive capacity to produce things that are more sensible than individual passenger cars. Migrant workers in agriculture and textile, new student movements. So we can see that somehow on the background of the anti-war movement, parts of the class are moving that, again, because of their particular position, being it like dock workers with international links, car workers with a productive collectivity, or migrant workers with like very immediate understanding of how state violence and industry works together. I think that that can be a basis to reconfigure something like a class movement. But these are only like the parts. It's the questions like how do you relate to each other? How do you form like a debate about social alternative beyond an immediate reaction to the war or an immediate reaction to, oh, they're going to close our factory down. But yeah, I think it's there. The question is, where are the political collectives that somehow debate that together, or who collectives that intervene, that take a responsibility for either a small working class area or a certain workplace and say, okay, we contribute on the basis that we are working in our case in a hospital with 18,000 people. It's an international workforce. We take on the little responsibility to try to connect that collective or not yet collective of 18,000 people with a wider debate about war, migration, social change. And that's it's a kind of a basic task, but it's not often done, or we don't find a lot of people who do similar things. Let's put it like that.
In regards to the current war or wars, there's at least 3 that I know of. And its effect on the working class, I think it is interesting how much industry, probably more so in Europe than the United States, but it'll hit in the United States eventually, has been disrupted by these wars. What has the working class response been? Because in the United States, for the first time, general public seems to not support these wars at all, even in the beginning. That's not supporting them in the beginning is somewhat new. It also seems like they don't benefit economically from the wars in the way that they used to in the past. The production just doesn't really go to workers in the same way. But how's it affecting Europe? And, as implied by your last statement, how do you turn, legitimate and necessary anti-war sentiment? I'm not crapping on anti-war sentiment in any way, form, or fashion, but like into something more systemic than that, because you don't want it to go away if the war just happens to end.
Yeah. I mean, let's say Germany, because it's, probably more even involved in the sense of the planning for a future larger war than maybe even England, although England obviously is more involvement in with the US Army. I think in Germany, people are aware of the, let's say, inflationary consequence of the war, in the sense like, people see a connection between austerity and rearmament, or shifting of, let's say, state money from a sector that is mainly dealing with reproduction of the local class into, rearmament. That's something that I think it's people know. The question is like, do people develop an idea how their particular situation might be involved? And in the health sector, for example, the German state changed the law that in case of war, you basically conscripted as a health worker. They know that the current capacity of army hospitals and whatever, they're nothing. I mean, they would fill up within like 2 days of intensity, like in Ukraine, with that kind of level of injuries and casualties. So they will need the civilian health sector to basically bolster that war effort and patch enough soldiers up to go back to the front line, because these kind of large-scale wars, they wouldn't work if there wouldn't be a health sector. I mean, you would run out of soldiers, basically. A lot of the injuries are, minor in the sense that, you can be patched up and be sent back in a month. And wars nowadays, they depend on that. So there's a starting debate amongst health workers and doctors to say we don't want that, you know, our hospital is kind of integrated in these kind of maneuvers and army strategies. So nowadays there are often, you know, from workshops to actual, you know, that it's normally done as like, oh, we do some practice for an emergency case, but it becomes clearer and clearer that that emergency case is a future war. So like health workers question, you know, within their own means, uh, this kind of militarization of their sector. School students, I mean, there were bigger demonstrations in various towns in Germany against a plan to reintroduce conscription. So I think, you know, car workers who, you know, Germany is hit by automobile crisis like everywhere, and they're thinking about converting some of the current capacities into rearmament or you know, weapon production. So there is, you know, a small voices that question that within the sector. I think, to answer the question of, you know, what happens if the war is over and does it disappear, I mean, I think we have to politicize all that in the direction of, you know, worker control. Like why should it be the boss who decides how we produce and what we produce? Why should, in our case, in our hospital, the CEO is like an army man, ex-army. He invites the army to have recruitment stalls inside our hospital. We should have, you know, a say. We should have a say in this, you know, and basically say, like, you know, question the dominance of markets and corporate decisions over the labor of over all labor. And I think that's what could happen out of that. You know, maybe initially it's a reaction to, you know, being drafted in things and more immediate relation to the war, but like what could come out of it is like a larger question of you know, who controls what we're doing.
Yeah, and I guess as my final question, it seems like one of the major things that you feel we need to focus on is worker control, but worker control in the context of a global proletariat that is both I mean, universalized is not quite true. I mean, there's still, you know, probably 20% of the population that is not any sort of wage owner or piece worker. But near universalized, I mean, definitely more than any other time in the past. And but one that has a lot more divisions in terms of just raw material interests than, you know, we could have assumed in the beginning of the 20th century. So how do we push for worker control with that reality in mind, that we know there's going to be tensions between sectors and whatnot?
Good question. No, I mean, like, I think a lot of the experiments that come out of, for example, factory takeovers, like we saw in Argentina, or even now the one in Italy with GKN, I think they remain necessarily like small examples where, you know, workers realize, okay, we don't need management to do our job. But I think the challenge will be to say, okay, we remain part of a larger movement, and our particular factory or workplace becomes like an asset of the movement, a meeting ground, a kind of convergence place where different sectors of the class can come together. Otherwise, I mean, it's a larger debate, the so-called whatever planning debate. We had a few discussions about the old text, fundamental principles of communist production and circulation. I think it's called in English, of like council communists. And I mean, that's a debate of, you know, trying to find a system, labor time accounting and so on, that somehow guarantees or kind of facilitates that workers keep in control of the planning process, and that there's not like a sharp separation between the planners who control and the workers. So it's kind of these kind of debates, I think, are fruitful, because they enable us to really think a bit deeper. What is a communist mode of production? Is it just that, the product is shared out equally and that labor is shared out equally, or is there a deeper qualitative shift actually in the process of producing what we share out? And what is possible under given conditions to create a new form of, let's say, social labor that, from questioning division of intellectual manual labor, or sharp lines between production reproduction, what could it look like? And I think we are at a point where, let's say, the motivation to create a social alternative also becomes part of the struggle. I mean, it used to be, or our position used to be, okay, let's not worry too much about developing a picture of social alternative. All this will come out of the movement itself. But I think in the current moment, where you just see, like, barbarism is in front of us, I think the idea, also like a scientific idea, we can, with the given resources and all the problems that we have with our relation with nature, we can produce in a different way that doesn't keep us locked in repetitive jobs. It's a basic debate that we can lead already now, and I think it can become a motivational force of struggle rather than just the outcome of it. But yeah, that's probably it's a wider debate. So far, I think the discussion about planning, social planning, are limited in that sense that they see the main problem as, okay, how do we reconcile like individual needs of consumption with some kind of flexible planning system? And I think that's somehow a bit misleading. I think that won't be our major problem.
Well, thank you for your time. I think I've gotten a good sense of where you guys are at. Where can people follow what the Angry Workers Collective is doing and writing right now?
Well, we've still got our blog. It's www.angryworkers.org. Or we've got like a blog for the health workers experience, which is called www.vitalsciencemag.org. And if you're a health worker or health workers, we do a lot of interviews as well. So feel free to get in touch. We spoke to some nurses in Chicago and Minnesota and California, which was really good. So yeah, if you listen to this and want to speak to some health workers, that would be cool. Can exchange some ideas. Right. So yeah, it was maybe not the most cohesive, but I worked like a 13-hour shift yesterday and I'm still a bit muddled.
I understand that healthcare workers are like that. My mom was a nurse.
Right.
So thank you for your time, and I will link everything you brought up in the show notes. Have a great rest of your day.
Yeah, nice one. Take care. Ciao.
You too.